Hi, I'm Zara. My stepmother Veronica watched my 2-year-old brother crawl toward a running cement mixer and did absolutely nothing. When I screamed and dove to save him, she called me hysterical and banned me from family events. 3 days later, our great-uncle's will was read, and what happened next made her face go white as concrete dust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning air in Millfield, Colorado, bit at my cheeks as I walked across the gravel yard of Donovan Stone and Aggregate. The Rocky Mountains loomed behind the quarry like sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with early snow that caught the pale sunrise. I could hear the familiar rumble of machinery starting up for the day shift, the deep growl of diesel engines mixing with the sharp crack of stone against metal. This place had been my playground as a child, back when Dad would let me ride in the cab of the dump trucks and watch the crushers turn boulders into perfect aggregate. That was before Veronica entered our lives like a landslide, swift and destructive, reshaping everything in her path. I pulled my worn denim jacket tighter as I approached the main office, a weathered building that sat between the processing plant and the family mansion on the hill. Overlook Manor cast its shadow down over the industrial complex, a Victorian monument to 3 generations of Donovan's success in the stone business. The contrast always struck me as oddly fitting. Beauty built on the foundation of honest, dirty work. My steel-toed boots crunched on the limestone chips that covered every surface of the yard. I'd learned to walk in these boots before I learned to walk in heels, though Veronica had made it clear that such unfeminine behavior was no longer acceptable for a Donovan woman. The irony wasn't lost on me that the Donovan name came from my father's side, yet somehow she'd appointed herself the arbiter of family standards. I pushed through the office door, the familiar smell of coffee and diesel fuel greeting me like an old friend. Helen Price, our longtime accountant, looked up from her desk with tired eyes that had seen too many early mornings counting profits and losses. She'd been with the company since before I was born, back when my grandfather ran things with an iron fist and a fair handshake. "Morning, Zara," Helen said, her voice carrying that particular weariness that comes from watching a family business slowly tear itself apart. "Your father's in the back office with Veronica. They're going over the quarterly projections." I nodded, knowing that meant Dad was probably getting another lecture about modernizing operations and cutting costs. Veronica had opinions about everything, especially things she didn't understand. She'd married into the construction business, but approached it like a hostile takeover, rather than a legacy to preserve. The sound of raised voices drifted from the back office, and I caught fragments of conversation through the thin walls. Veronica's voice, sharp and insistent, talking about efficiency and redundancy. Dad's voice, quieter, more defensive, trying to explain why certain positions were essential for safety and quality control. I'd heard this argument before. It usually ended with Veronica getting her way, and longtime employees getting pink slips. I was about to knock when little Ethan came barreling around the corner, his chubby legs carrying him at that reckless toddler pace that makes adults' hearts skip beats. At 2 years old, he was all curiosity and no caution, with Dad's dark hair and Veronica's pale blue eyes. Despite being my half-brother, I'd fallen completely in love with him the moment he was born. He represented the one pure thing to come out of Dad's marriage to Veronica. "Zawa," he squealed, using his adorable mispronunciation of my name as he launched himself at my legs. I scooped him up, spinning him around until he giggled, that infectious belly laugh that could make even the grayest Colorado morning feel bright. "What are you doing here, little man?" I asked, settling him on my hip. "It's pretty early for you to be awake." "Mama had to come to work," he said, pointing toward the back office where the voices had grown louder. "She said I could play." My stomach tightened. The quarry and processing plant were no place for a toddler to play, even supervised. There were too many moving parts, too many ways for a small person to get hurt. The fact that Veronica had brought him here and then apparently forgotten about him while she argued with Dad made my protective instincts flare. "How about we find you something fun to do that's a little safer?" I suggested, carrying him toward Helen's desk where she kept a small basket of toys for occasions when employees brought their children to work. That's when I heard the cement mixer start up outside. The sound was distinctive, A deep mechanical rumbling followed by the slow rotation of the massive drum. Carlos Rivera must be preparing for the morning's first concrete delivery. I glanced out the window and saw the familiar sight of the big yellow mixer truck positioned near the loading area, its drums slowly turning as Carlos checked the hydraulics. Ethan wiggled in my arms, drawn by the sound and the movement. "Big truck!" he exclaimed with the enthusiasm only a 2-year-old could muster for heavy machinery. "That's right, buddy. That's a cement mixer. It makes concrete for buildings and roads." "Want to see?" "Maybe later, when it's not running," I said, but he was already squirming to get down. I held him tighter, knowing how quickly toddlers could disappear when something caught their interest. The back office door slammed open, and Veronica emerged looking like she'd won whatever argument had been happening. She was immaculately dressed, as always, in a cream-colored blazer and matching slacks that somehow managed to stay pristine, even in an industrial environment. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She looked like she belonged in a corporate boardroom, not a stone quarry, which I suppose was exactly the point. "Zara," she said, her tone suggesting my presence was an unwelcome surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here so early." "I like to check on things before the crews get busy," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Make sure everything's running smoothly." Her perfectly manicured eyebrow arched slightly. "That's very dedicated of you, though I'm not sure it's necessary. We have foremen for that sort of thing." The dismissal in her voice was clear. Since marrying Dad 3 years ago, Veronica had made it increasingly obvious that she saw me as superfluous to the business operations. Never mind that I'd grown up in this industry, that I understood the equipment and processes better than she ever would. Never mind that the workers respected me because I'd earned it, not inherited it through marriage. Dad appeared in the doorway behind her, looking older than his 55 years. The stress of trying to balance family harmony with business decisions was taking its toll. His once broad shoulders seemed permanently hunched now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened considerably since Veronica's arrival. "Morning, sweetheart," he said to me, then noticed Ethan in my arms. "There's my boy! Come give Daddy a hug." I passed Ethan over, watching Dad's face light up the way it always did when he held his youngest child. For all his faults and weaknesses, Dad genuinely loved his children. It was one of the things that made this whole situation so heartbreaking. "Veronica, maybe we should take Ethan back to the house," Dad suggested. "The yard's getting busy, and it's not really safe for little ones." "He's fine," Veronica said dismissively, already scrolling through something on her phone. "Children need to learn to navigate the real world, not be coddled constantly." I bit my tongue, remembering the last time I'd contradicted her parenting philosophy. The argument had lasted for hours, and ended with her threatening to ban me from family dinners. Dad had eventually talked her out of it, but the message was clear. Veronica's rules applied to everyone, including me. "I can take him up to the house," I offered. I was planning to stop by anyway to check on Uncle Frank. At the mention of Great Uncle Franklin, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Veronica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Dad shifted uncomfortably. Uncle Frank was Dad's uncle, Grandpa's younger brother, and technically still a partner in the business, though his exact role had become increasingly unclear since Veronica's influence grew. "Uncle Frank is resting," Veronica said firmly. "The doctor said he needs quiet, not constant visitors disturbing his recovery." Uncle Frank had suffered a mild heart attack 6 months ago, and since then, Veronica had appointed herself as gatekeeper for his care.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She claimed it was for his own good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than concern for his health. Uncle Frank had always been sharp as a tack, even at 78, and his sudden absence from business decisions felt suspicious. "Maybe just a quick visit," I pressed. "I know he likes to hear about the daily operations." "Absolutely not," Veronica's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I won't have you exhausting him with unnecessary chatter about trucks and schedules. He's an old man who needs rest, not stimulation." The way she said "old man" made my skin crawl. There was no respect in it. No acknowledgement of everything Uncle Frank had contributed to building this company. He'd worked alongside my grandfather for 40 years, had helped design the current quarry layout, and had been instrumental in securing the contracts that made Donovan Stone and Aggregate the premier supplier in the region. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe we should all head back to the house for breakfast. Maria's probably got something cooking. Maria Santos had been our housekeeper since I was 10, one of the few constants in our increasingly chaotic family dynamic. She'd taken care of me after Mom died, had helped Dad through his grief, and now found herself navigating the complicated politics of a blended family under Veronica's watchful eye. "You two go ahead," I said, setting Ethan down gently. "I want to talk to Carlos about the morning deliveries." Ethan immediately toddled toward the window, fascinated by the cement mixer visible outside. The drum was still turning slowly, and the hydraulic whine seemed to mesmerize him. "Big truck going round and round," he chanted, pressing his small hands against the glass. Veronica barely glanced at him, already moving toward the door. "Don't be long, Thomas. We have that conference call with the Denver contractors at 9. Dad nodded obediently, and I watched them leave with a familiar knot of frustration in my stomach. 3 years ago, Dad had been the undisputed head of this company. Now he seemed to defer to Veronica on everything, as if her MBA from some East Coast business school made her more qualified to run a quarry than his 30 years of hands-on experience. "Want to see the big truck?" Ethan asked, tugging on my jacket. "The trucks are working right now, buddy," I explained. "It's not safe to get too close when they're running." He nodded solemnly, though I doubted he truly understood. At his age, the concept of danger was still abstract. Everything was an adventure waiting to happen. Helen looked up from her paperwork. "Zara, honey, you might want to know that Marcus called this morning. He's flying in from Denver this afternoon." My stepbrother Marcus was 2 years older than me and had spent the last 4 years at Colorado State getting a business degree that Veronica insisted would be essential for the company's future. Unlike me, who'd chosen to stay close to home and learn the business from the ground up, Marcus had embraced the academic approach to industry knowledge. He talked a good game about efficiency and profit margins, but I'd yet to see him successfully operate a single piece of equipment or build relationships with the workers who actually made everything happen. "Did he say why he's coming home?" I asked, though I suspected it had something to do with the quarterly projections Veronica and Dad had been discussing. "Something about a family meeting," Helen said, her tone suggesting she found the whole thing as ominous as I did. A family meeting usually meant changes were coming, and changes in our family typically meant someone was about to get pushed aside. I'd been expecting something like this for months. Veronica had been making increasingly pointed comments about the need for fresh perspectives and new approaches to business management. Ethan had wandered away from the window and was now exploring the office with the determined focus of a toddler on a mission. He opened and closed drawers, examined the coffee machine with intense curiosity, and eventually made his way toward the back door that led directly to the loading area. "Whoa there, explorer," I said, catching him before he could reach the door handle. "Let's stay inside where it's safe." "Want to see trucks," he protested, but without real anger. He was generally an easygoing child, probably because he'd learned that throwing tantrums around Veronica rarely yielded positive results. I picked him up again, noting how much heavier he'd gotten in recent months. Soon he'd be too big to carry around, would be walking everywhere on his own, getting into everything, with that fearless curiosity that made toddlers both delightful and terrifying. Through the back window, I could see Carlos finishing his equipment check. The cement mixer's drum had stopped rotating, and he was walking around the truck doing his standard safety inspection. Carlos had been with the company for 15 years, ever since he'd immigrated from Mexico and started as a general laborer. He'd worked his way up through sheer determination and skill, becoming one of our most reliable operators. He was also one of the few employees who still talked to me like I belonged here, who asked my opinion on operational matters and actually listened to my answers. Most of the others had learned to defer to Veronica's authority, either out of fear for their jobs or simple pragmatism. "Zara," Helen said quietly, You should know that Veronica's been asking questions about the employee files, specifically about tenure and salary information. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions? The kind that usually come before layoffs, Helen replied, her voice heavy with resignation. She's been particularly interested in anyone who's been here more than 10 years. That would include Carlos, our shop foreman Pete McGrath, several of the truck drivers, and basically everyone who remembered what the company was like before Veronica's arrival. It would also include Helen herself, who'd been keeping the book since before I was born. She can't just fire everyone with experience, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I realized how naive they sounded. Veronica had been methodically consolidating power since the day she married Dad. Removing the old guard would be a logical next step. If she convinces your father it's necessary for profitability, Helen pointed out, and Marcus will back her up when he gets here. That boy's been singing her praises since freshman year. The unfairness of it all hit me like a physical blow. These people had given their best years to our family business. They'd worked through economic downturns, equipment failures, and weather delays. They'd celebrated our successes and weathered our challenges with loyalty and dedication. Now they were being viewed as expendable assets to be eliminated for the sake of quarterly profit margins. Ethan had grown restless in my arms and was squirming to get down again. "Want down, Zara, want to play." I set him on his feet, keeping a careful eye on him as he resumed his exploration of the office. The morning sun was climbing higher, and I could hear more equipment starting up outside as the full crew arrived for the day shift. Soon the yard would be bustling with activity, trucks coming and going, loaders moving material, the controlled chaos of a successful operation. Maybe I should take him back to the house. I mused, watching Ethan investigate a filing cabinet with the intensity of a private detective. Might be for the best, Helen agreed, though you should know that Veronica specifically said she didn't want him up there while the cleaning crew is working. Something about chemicals and fumes. That struck me as odd. Maria had been cleaning the house with the same products for years, and Ethan had never been sensitive to any of them. But then again, Veronica had been instituting a lot of new rules lately, most of them designed to keep people away from Uncle Frank. A sharp crack from outside made us both look toward the loading area. Carlos was backing the cement mixer away from the loading station, preparing to head out for his first delivery of the day. The truck's backup alarm echoed across the yard, that distinctive beeping that warned everyone to stay clear. Ethan's head snapped up at the sound, his eyes bright with excitement. "Big truck moving!" He started toward the back door again, moving with that surprising speed that toddlers could summon when something captured their interest. I moved to intercept him, but he was quicker than I expected, his small fingers reaching for the door handle, just as I realized what was happening. The door was already slightly ajar, left that way by whoever had come through earlier. Ethan pushed it open and stepped outside before I could catch him. "Ethan, no!" I called, lunging after him as he toddled directly toward the moving cement mixer. Carlos couldn't see him from the driver's seat. The truck was too big, the blind spots too numerous. Ethan was heading straight for the rear wheels, drawn by the flashing lights and beeping sounds like a moth to flame. I burst through the door and sprinted across the gravel, my boots slipping on the loose stone as I pushed myself faster than I'd ever moved in my life. The cement mixer was still backing up, Carlos following his normal route to the exit gate, completely unaware that a 2-year-old was walking directly into his path. "Carlos, stop!" I screamed, but the backup alarm drowned out my voice. Ethan was less than 6 feet from the truck's rear bumper when I reached him, scooping him up and diving sideways just as the massive vehicle continued its backward trajectory. We hit the gravel hard, my shoulder taking most of the impact as I curled around Ethan to protect him from the fall. The cement mixer stopped immediately as Carlos caught sight of us in his mirror. He jumped out of the cab, his face pale with shock as he realized how close we'd come to tragedy. "Dios mío," he breathed, kneeling beside us. "Are you hurt? Is the little one okay?" I sat up slowly, checking Ethan for injuries. He was crying now, more from fear and surprise than actual pain. But he seemed unharmed. My shoulder throbbed where it had hit the ground, and I could feel gravel embedded in my palms. But we were both alive. "We're okay," I managed, pulling Ethan close as he sobbed against my chest. "We're okay, baby. You're safe." "What happened?" Carlos asked, his voice shaking. "How did he get out here?" "He got away from me," I said, though the words felt inadequate. The truth was that a 2-year-old had nearly died because adults hadn't been paying close enough attention. Because his mother had brought him to a dangerous workplace and then abandoned him to argue about profit margins. "Zara!" Dad's voice cut across the yard as he came running from the direction of the house. "What's going on?" We heard shouting. Behind him, Veronica followed at a more measured pace, her expression unreadable. When she saw us sitting in the gravel, Ethan crying in my arms, her face cycled through several emotions too quickly for me to identify them all. Ethan wandered outside. I explained as Dad helped us to our feet. He almost walked into the cement mixer while Carlos was backing up. Dad's face went white. He reached for Ethan, who transferred easily to his father's arms, still sniffling but calming down now that the immediate danger had passed. "How did he get outside?" Dad asked, looking between me and Carlos as if we were somehow responsible for the near miss. "The door was open," I said. "He pushed through before I could stop him." Veronica had reached us by then, and I expected her to be frantic with worry for her son. Instead, she looked at me with cold calculation. "Why were you watching him?" she asked, her tone suggesting I was somehow to blame for the incident. I stared at her in disbelief. "You left him in the office while you had your meeting. I was trying to keep him safe. By taking him near dangerous equipment?" Her voice was rising now, taking on that pitch that meant she was building toward one of her dramatic scenes. "By letting him run around unsupervised in an active construction zone?" "I didn't let him do anything," I protested. "I saved him from getting hurt." "You nearly got him killed with your negligence," Veronica snapped. "This is exactly the kind of irresponsible behavior I've been talking about, Thomas. She has no business being around the operations if she can't even watch a child properly." The injustice of the accusation hit me like a slap. I had risked my own safety to protect Ethan, had literally thrown myself in front of a moving truck to save him, and somehow I was being blamed for the danger he'd been in. "That's not fair," I said, my voice shaking with anger and adrenaline. "You're the one who brought a toddler to a quarry and then ignored him. How dare you?" Veronica's eyes flashed with fury. "I am his mother. I don't need parenting advice from someone who clearly can't handle basic responsibilities." Dad stood there holding Ethan, looking back and forth between us like a referee in a boxing match he didn't want to judge. This was his pattern now, avoiding taking sides in conflicts between Veronica and me, as if neutrality was the same thing as wisdom. "Maybe we should all calm down," he suggested weakly. "The important thing is that everyone's safe." "The important thing," Veronica said, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that preceded her most devastating pronouncements, "is that this kind of incident cannot happen again." She turned to face me directly, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was opportunity. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your role in this family and this business," she continued. "Clearly, the current arrangement isn't working for anyone." The words hung in the air like a threat, and I realized that what had started as a near accident was about to become something much worse. Veronica had found her excuse, the incident she could point to as justification for whatever she'd been planning all along. Carlos, who had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Señora, with respect, Zara saved the boy's life. If she hadn't acted so quickly, no one asked for your opinion." Veronica cut him off sharply. "And I'd suggest you focus on your own responsibilities instead of making excuses for others' failures." The dismissal in her tone was clear, and I saw Carlos's jaw tighten with anger. But he was smart enough to know that arguing with the boss's wife was a good way to lose his job, especially when she was already looking for reasons to cut the workforce. "I think we should continue this conversation at home," Dad said, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. Away from the crew. He was right. By now, several other workers had noticed the commotion and were watching from a respectful distance. The last thing any of us needed was for this family drama to become workplace gossip. "Fine," Veronica agreed. But I wanted understood that Zara is no longer welcome in the operational areas of this business. Her judgment has proven to be dangerously unreliable. The words hit me like a physical blow. Being banned from the quarry and processing plant would effectively end my involvement in the day-to-day operations of the company. It would reduce me to an outsider, someone who inherited a name but not the right to use it meaningfully. "You can't do that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is my family's business too." "Your family's business," Veronica repeated, her smile sharp as broken glass. "How interesting that you phrase it that way." "We'll definitely need to discuss exactly what that means, won't we?" She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown timer. Dad followed her, still carrying Ethan, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, exhausted by the morning's drama. I stood there in the gravel, my clothes dirty, my shoulder aching, watching my family disappear into the distance. Carlos placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Miss Zara," he said quietly, "you did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you different." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The right thing had never felt so much like the end of everything I'd ever cared about. 3 days passed in a haze of isolation and uncertainty. Veronica had made good on her threat to ban me from the operational areas, leaving me to wander the edges of my own family's property like a trespasser. I spent most of my time in the old maintenance shed that sat on the far side of the quarry, a building that technically wasn't part of the restricted zone but felt miles away from the heart of the business I'd grown up loving. The shed had been Uncle Frank's domain for decades, filled with blueprints, equipment manuals, and the accumulated wisdom of a man who understood every bolt and bearing in our operation. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows, and the air smelled of motor oil and old leather from the work boots Uncle Frank kept in the corner. I'd been sorting through boxes of technical documents, partly to keep myself busy, and partly because I was looking for something, though I wasn't sure what. Maybe evidence that I belonged here, that my connection to this place went deeper than Veronica's arbitrary restrictions could sever. That's when I found the folder marked Partnership Documents Original 1987. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, revealing yellowed papers covered in legal language and signatures I recognized. There was Grandpa's bold handwriting, Dad's younger signature, and Uncle Frank's careful script. But what caught my attention was a clause I'd never heard discussed in family conversations about the business structure. In the event of Thomas Donovan's incapacitation or death, operational control of Donovan Stone and Aggregate shall transfer to Franklin Donovan as senior partner, with inheritance rights passing to the next generation as determined by the surviving senior partner's discretion. Quote. I read the passage 3 times before the implications sank in. Uncle Frank wasn't just Dad's uncle and business partner. According to this document, he was the designated successor, the one with the authority to determine inheritance. All these years, I'd assumed Dad would simply pass the business to his children according to standard succession practices. But this clause suggested something entirely different. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Sunrise Diner on Highway 285. Come alone. Important information about your family. A friend." Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored such a cryptic message. But nothing about my circumstances felt normal anymore. I was banned from my own family's business, treated like a pariah by my stepmother, and apparently cut out of conversations about my own future. A mysterious message promising information seemed like the least dangerous thing that had happened to me all week. The drive to Sunrise Diner took me through the winding mountain roads that connected Millfield to the outside world. October in Colorado painted the aspen trees in brilliant gold, and the contrast against the evergreen pines created a landscape so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. This was the country I'd grown up in, the place that had shaped my understanding of hard work and natural beauty existing side by side. Sunrise Diner was a local institution, the kind of place where truckers and ranchers gathered for coffee strong enough to wake the dead and gossip reliable enough to plan your life around. The parking lot was mostly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just a few pickup trucks and a sedan I didn't recognize. I pushed through the door, the familiar smell of grease and coffee greeting me like an old friend. The waitress, Betty, had been serving coffee here since I was in high school. She looked up from her crossword puzzle and smiled. Zara Donovan, haven't seen you in a while. How's the family business treating you? Could be better, I admitted, scanning the mostly empty booths for anyone who might be my mysterious correspondent. Booth in the back, Betty said quietly, nodding toward the far corner where a woman in a dark coat sat with her back to the door. She's been waiting for about 20 minutes. Ordered nothing but coffee. I walked slowly toward the back booth, my boots echoing on the checkered linoleum floor. As I got closer, the woman turned around, and I found myself looking at someone I'd never expected to see again. Linda Castellano had been Uncle Frank's personal assistant for over a decade before she'd suddenly left the company 18 months ago. Veronica had explained her departure as a voluntary resignation, a desire to spend more time with family. But Linda's expression as she gestured for me to sit down suggested the story might be more complicated than that. "Thank you for coming," Linda said, her voice lower than I remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd risk it." "Risk what?" I asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "Meeting with a former employee?" Linda's laugh was bitter. "Former employee? Is that what they're calling it now?" She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table between us. "Zara, there are things happening in your family that you need to know about. Things that would break your uncle's heart if he knew." "What kind of things?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "Do you know why I really left Donovan Stone and Aggregate?" Linda asked, her fingers drumming nervously on the envelope. I shook my head, remembering only Veronica's vague explanation about family priorities. "I was fired," Linda said bluntly. "Veronica accused me of stealing from petty cash, said she'd found discrepancies in my expense reports. It was all fabricated, but she had documentation that looked convincing enough to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. Why would she do that?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because I was asking too many questions about Uncle Frank's medical care," Linda replied. "And because I refused to stop scheduling his appointments with his longtime physician." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. She wanted him to see a different doctor. "Dr. Patricia Hendricks," Linda confirmed, "a neurologist from Denver who specializes in age-related cognitive decline. Very expensive, very willing to provide certain diagnoses when properly motivated." Linda opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photocopied medical records. "I made copies of everything before they changed the locks on my office. Take a look at the progression of Uncle Frank's supposed condition." I examined the documents with growing horror. The reports painted a picture of a man experiencing rapid mental deterioration, memory loss, and decreased decision-making capacity. But the timeline didn't match my own observations of Uncle Frank's behavior before his heart attack. "These are all from after his heart episode," I noted. "But I saw him just a few days before that happened. He was sharp as ever, talking about new equipment purchases and contract negotiations." "Exactly," Linda said. "And look at the signature on the consent forms for these evaluations." I flipped to the authorization pages and felt my stomach drop. The signature was shaky, uncertain, nothing like Uncle Frank's normally steady handwriting. It looked like the signature of someone heavily medicated or coerced. "She's been drugging him," I whispered, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. "I can't prove that," Linda said carefully. "But I can tell you that his medication regimen changed dramatically after Veronica took over his care coordination. And I can tell you that Dr. Hendricks has a reputation for being very accommodating to family members who need certain legal determinations made quickly." Betty appeared at our table with a fresh pot of coffee, her timing impeccable as always. "You girls need anything else? Pie? The apple's fresh today." "Just coffee," I managed, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. After Betty left, Linda leaned across the table. "There's more. Financial records that show significant transfers from Uncle Frank's personal accounts to investment vehicles controlled by Veronica. Real estate purchases made in his name but clearly intended for her benefit." "How do you know all this?" I asked. "Because I was the one who processed most of the paperwork," Linda replied, "until I started asking questions about the legitimacy of the authorizations. That's when Veronica decided I was a liability." I stared at the medical records, trying to process the magnitude of what Linda was suggesting. If Uncle Frank was being deliberately incapacitated, If his medical condition was being exaggerated or artificially induced, then everything about our family's recent power structure was built on fraud. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Why not go to the police or a lawyer?" Linda's expression darkened. "Because I tried that. Filed a report with Elder Protective Services. Contacted an attorney who specializes in financial abuse cases. But Veronica was ahead of me. She had documentation showing that I'd been terminated for theft, making me look like a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind." "So nothing happened?" "The investigation was closed after 2 weeks," Linda confirmed. "Insufficient evidence," they said. Dr. Hendricks provided testimony about Uncle Frank's condition, and Veronica presented financial records showing that all transactions were properly authorized. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. If Linda, with her years of experience and detailed knowledge of the business operations, couldn't make a case against Veronica, what chance did I have? "But there's something else," Linda continued. "Something that might change everything." She pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table. 3 days before I was fired, I was working late in the office when Veronica had a phone call she thought was private. She was in Uncle Frank's office, going through his files, and she didn't realize the intercom system was still active. Linda pressed play, and Veronica's voice filled the space between us, crystal clear and chillingly matter-of-fact. "The old man won't be a problem much longer. Dr. Hendricks says we can have him declared incompetent within the month if we increase the dosage. Once that's done, Thomas will have full power of attorney, and we can restructure everything according to our timeline." Another voice came through the recording, male and unfamiliar to me. "What about the girl? She's been asking questions about the operational changes." "Zara is sentimental, but not particularly smart," Veronica's voice replied. "She'll make noise for a while, but without Uncle Frank's support, she has no real leverage. Besides, I'm working on a plan to remove her from the equation entirely. The brother might be more useful in the long run," the male voice suggested. "Easier to control, more aligned with modern business practices." "Marcus understands the reality of the situation," Veronica agreed. "He knows that loyalty to the old ways is a luxury we can't afford. Once we consolidate control, we can phase out the sentimental employees and focus on maximizing profitability." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing plans to sell off parcels of company land, eliminate long-time employees, and restructure the business as a purely profit-driven enterprise. By the time it ended, I felt like I'd been physically assaulted. "When was this recorded?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 18 months ago, Linda replied. "Right around the time Uncle Frank started showing his first symptoms." "We have to do something with this," I said, my mind racing through possibilities. "This is evidence of conspiracy, maybe even attempted murder." "It's evidence of a private conversation obtained without consent," Linda corrected gently. "Any lawyer will tell you it's inadmissible in court. But it might be enough to convince the right people to take a closer look at the situation." "What people?" I asked. Linda smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Uncle Frank's oldest friend happens to be a retired federal judge. Judge William Morrison lives about 40 minutes from here, up in Fairplay. He and your uncle served together in Vietnam, stayed close ever since." "You think he'd help us?" "I think he'd be very interested to know what's been happening to his old friend," Linda said. "Especially if we can present him with enough evidence to justify a formal investigation." She pulled out another set of documents from the envelope. "These are copies of Uncle Frank's original business partnership agreements, his will from 5 years ago, and the medical power of attorney documents that Veronica filed 6 months ago. Look at the dates and signatures carefully." I spread the papers across the table, comparing signatures and noting discrepancies that jumped out even to my untrained eye. The power of attorney's signature looked nothing like Uncle Frank's handwriting from the earlier documents. "This is forgery," I said, stating the obvious. "Among other things," Linda agreed. "But we need more than document analysis to make a case. We need Uncle Frank himself to contradict the medical diagnoses, to demonstrate that he's been competent all along. How do we do that when Veronica controls his access to visitors?" "That's where things get interesting," Linda said, pulling out her phone. Maria Santos called me yesterday. Apparently, she's been growing increasingly concerned about Uncle Frank's condition and Veronica's treatment of him. Maria, our longtime housekeeper, had been with the family through every major transition and crisis. If anyone would notice changes in Uncle Frank's behavior or routine, it would be her. "What did Maria say?" I asked. "That Uncle Frank's been asking for you specifically," Linda replied. "That he seems confused about why you haven't been visiting, and that he's been more alert and coherent when Veronica isn't around. She's been telling him that I don't want to see him," I realized, the cruelty of it hitting me like a physical blow. Among other lies, Linda confirmed. But Maria also said that Veronica has a standing appointment in Denver every Thursday afternoon. Something about a spa treatment that takes several hours. She leaves the house around noon and doesn't return until evening. "Tomorrow is Thursday," I said, understanding immediately. "Tomorrow is Thursday." Linda agreed. "And Maria will be the only person in the house with Uncle Frank for most of the afternoon." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we were contemplating settling between us. Approaching Uncle Frank directly would mean defying Veronica's explicit orders, risking further retaliation, and potentially putting him in a difficult position if he truly was as incapacitated as the medical records suggested. But if Linda was right, if Uncle Frank was being systematically drugged and isolated, then every day we waited was another day of abuse continuing unchecked. "There's something else you should know?" Linda said, her voice dropping even lower. "About the timing of Uncle Frank's heart attack." "What about it?" "It happened the day after he told me he wanted to revise his will," Linda said. "He'd been talking about it for weeks, about making sure his assets were distributed according to his true wishes, rather than just following standard inheritance patterns. The implications of that revelation hit me like a freight train. You think Veronica knew about his plans? I think Veronica has been monitoring his communications more closely than anyone realizes," Linda replied. "And I think the stress of whatever confrontation might have occurred between them could have triggered his cardiac episode." "Are you saying she deliberately caused his heart attack?" "I'm saying the timing was awfully convenient for someone who needed to establish medical grounds for questioning his competency," Linda said carefully. "And I'm saying that people have done worse things for less money than what's at stake here. I thought about the Donovan Stone and aggregate operation, the value of the land alone, the established contracts and customer relationships built over 3 generations. We weren't talking about pocket change. We were talking about millions of dollars in assets and the foundation of economic life for dozens of families in Millfield. If we do this," I said slowly, "if we approach Uncle Frank directly, what exactly are we hoping to accomplish?" "Documentation," Linda replied immediately. "Video evidence of his actual mental state, recorded testimony about what he remembers and what he intended, proof that contradicts the medical evaluations that have been used to justify Veronica's control over his affairs." "And then what? Take it to Judge Morrison?" "Judge Morrison first, then the State Attorney General's office if necessary," Linda confirmed. "Financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is a felony in Colorado, especially when it involves fraud and forgery." I stared at the documents spread across the table, feeling the weight of a decision that could change everything. Either Uncle Frank was genuinely incapacitated, and I was about to exploit a sick old man for my own benefit, or he was being systematically abused and I was his only hope for rescue. "There's one more thing," Linda said, reaching into her purse again. "Something I probably should have led with, but I wanted you to understand the full scope of the situation first." She pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and bearing Uncle Frank's careful handwriting. My name was written across the front in his distinctive script. "He gave this to me about a week before his heart attack," Linda explained. "Asked me to hold on to it and only give it to you if something happened to him or if he became unable to communicate his wishes clearly." My hands shook as I opened the envelope, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in Uncle Frank's handwriting. "My dear Zara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears about family loyalty and business integrity have likely come to pass. There are things you need to know about your inheritance and your rightful place in this company, things that certain people have been working very hard to keep hidden from you." I looked up at Linda, who was watching my face carefully. "How long have you been carrying this?" 18 months, she replied. Through my firing, through the failed investigation, through watching Veronica consolidate more and more control while Uncle Frank supposedly deteriorated. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to honor his request. And you think tomorrow is that moment? I think tomorrow might be our last chance, Linda said solemnly, because Marcus is coming home this weekend for what Veronica is calling a family restructuring meeting. After that, any legal challenges to the current power structure are going to become much more difficult. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a talisman. Uncle Frank had trusted me with something important, had seen this crisis coming and tried to prepare for it. The least I could do was honor that trust. "What time should I be at the house tomorrow?" I asked. Linda smiled, the first genuine expression of hope I'd seen from her all afternoon. Maria suggested around 2 o'clock. Veronica should be well on her way to Denver by then, and the afternoon shift workers will be focused on the quarry operations. "And you'll be there too?" Quote, "I'll be waiting in my car at the bottom of the hill," Linda promised, "with recording equipment and a direct line to Judge Morrison's chambers. Whatever we discover tomorrow, we'll make sure it's properly documented and legally preserved." We sat in the diner for another hour, going over details and contingencies, preparing for every scenario we could imagine. By the time I drove back to Millfield, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of my childhood, when the family business felt like a legacy worth inheriting, rather than a prize worth fighting over. That evening, I ate dinner alone in my small apartment above the feed store, reading and rereading Uncle Frank's letter. The full text revealed a complex picture of family loyalty, business ethics, and personal responsibility that I'd never fully understood before. Uncle Frank knew about Veronica's ambitions, had been watching her maneuvering for months before his heart attack. He'd documented financial irregularities, questionable personnel decisions, and what he called a systematic campaign to undermine the values and relationships that built this company. More importantly, he'd made legal preparations to protect both the business and the employees who depended on it. Hidden in his careful prose were references to trust funds, succession plans, and contractual obligations that Veronica apparently knew nothing about. "Your grandfather and I built this company on handshake deals and mutual respect," one passage read. "We believed that treating people fairly would create loyalty, and that loyalty would create lasting success. I fear that philosophy is under attack by people who see relationships as weaknesses to be exploited, rather than strengths to be cultivated." The letter ended with specific instructions about documents hidden in his personal safe, legal contacts who could be trusted to act in my interests, and a warning about the urgency of the situation. "Time is not on our side," Uncle Frank had written. "The longer these deceptions continue, the harder they will be to unravel. Trust your instincts, protect the people who have protected you, and remember that sometimes doing the right thing requires risking everything you think you want in order to preserve everything you know you need." I fell asleep that night with the letter on my nightstand, Uncle Frank's words echoing in my mind like a prayer or a battle cry. Tomorrow would determine whether I was strong enough to fight for the legacy I'd inherited, or whether I'd watch it disappear under the weight of other people's ambitions. The last thing I remembered before drifting off was the sound of the quarry equipment shutting down for the night, the familiar rhythm of diesel engines and hydraulic systems that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. Whatever happened tomorrow, I was going to make sure that sound continued for the workers and families who depended on it, regardless of what it cost me personally. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I drove up the winding road to Overlook Manor with my heart hammering against my ribs, Uncle Frank's letter folded in my jacket pocket like a secret weapon I wasn't sure how to use. The Victorian mansion looked different in the afternoon light, more imposing somehow, its gabled roof and wraparound porch casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. This had been my second home growing up, the place where Uncle Frank would tell stories about the early days of the quarry, while Grandma baked cookies that filled the whole house with the smell of vanilla and brown sugar. Now it felt like enemy territory. I parked at the side entrance where the service road met the main driveway, the same spot where delivery trucks had always unloaded supplies. Maria had left the garden gate unlocked as promised, and I slipped through the hedgerow that separated the formal gardens from the working areas of the property. The house seemed quieter than usual, missing the constant hum of activity that had characterized it during my childhood. No radio playing in the kitchen, no sound of Maria's vacuum cleaner or the rhythmic chop of vegetables being prepared for dinner. Just an unsettling stillness that made every footstep feel too loud. I found Maria in the laundry room, folding towels with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been doing the same task for 20 years. She looked up when I entered, her weathered face breaking into a smile that held both relief and concern. Quote, "Mija," she said softly, using the Spanish endearment she'd called me since childhood. "I was hoping you would come." "How is he, Maria?" I asked, keeping my voice low even though we were supposed to be alone in the house. "Some days better than others," she replied, setting down a pillowcase and moving closer to me. "But Zara, he is not the confused old man that woman says he is. When she is not here, when the medicine wears off, he asks about you constantly." "What medicine?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Maria glanced toward the stairs that led to the upper floors where Uncle Frank's suite was located. "Pills for his heart," she says. "But so many pills, Mija, more than any person should need. And they make him sleepy, confused, like his mind is wrapped in fog." "Has he been asking for anything specific? Saying anything about the business or legal matters?" "Yesterday he kept asking about papers," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Papers he hid in his safe before the heart attack. He said they were important, that you would need them when the time came." I felt a surge of hope mixed with urgency. If Uncle Frank was lucid enough to remember important documents, then maybe the medical evaluations that had declared him incompetent were as fraudulent as Linda suspected. "Is Veronica really gone?" I asked. "Left 2 hours ago in that fancy car of hers." Maria confirmed, told me she would be back around 6, maybe 7 if the traffic from Denver is bad. That gave us approximately 3 hours to document Uncle Frank's actual mental state and hopefully retrieve whatever papers he'd hidden before his condition supposedly deteriorated. 3 hours to gather evidence that could expose Veronica's systematic deception and restore Uncle Frank's legal autonomy. "Can you take me to him?" I asked. Maria nodded, leading me through the familiar corridors of the house toward the back staircase that accessed Uncle Frank's private quarters. The walls were lined with family photographs spanning 3 generations, images of quarry operations, company picnics, and milestone celebrations that told the story of a business built on relationships rather than just profit margins. We paused outside Uncle Frank's sitting room, and Maria turned to me with an expression of maternal concern that reminded me of all the times she'd worried about scraped knees and hurt feelings during my childhood. "Mija, you should know that he may not recognize you immediately," she said gently. "The medicine, it affects his memory, makes him think sometimes that years have passed, or that people who visit him are from long ago. But he's been asking for me specifically?" "When his mind is clear, yes," Maria confirmed. "And when it is clear, he is very worried about what has been happening to the business, to the family. He knows something is wrong, but the confusion comes and goes like waves." I took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door, hearing Uncle Frank's voice call out weakly for us to enter. Maria opened the door and stepped aside, allowing me to see him for the first time in 6 months. The change was shocking. Uncle Frank had always been a robust man, thick through the shoulders from decades of physical labor, with hands that looked like they could still operate heavy machinery despite his advanced age. The man sitting in the leather recliner by the window looked like a shadow of that person, thin and pale, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk considerably. But his eyes, when they focused on me, were still sharp with intelligence. "Zara?" he said, his voice uncertain at first, then growing stronger with recognition. "Zara, is that really you?" "It's me, Uncle Frank," I said, crossing the room quickly to kneel beside his chair. "I'm so sorry I haven't been to see you. I was told you needed rest, that visitors weren't allowed." His hand reached out to touch my face, fingers trembling but surprisingly warm. I've been asking for you for months. They told me you were too busy, that you'd moved away for work. The cruelty of that lie hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been struggling with guilt about not visiting, Uncle Frank had been told that I'd abandoned him by choice. Veronica had systematically isolated him from the one family member who might have questioned his supposed mental deterioration. "I would never abandon you," I said, taking his hand in both of mine. "I've been worried sick, but Veronica said the doctors recommended no visitors except immediate family." Uncle Frank's expression darkened, and suddenly he looked more like the shrewd businessman who'd helped build our family empire. "That woman has been poisoning everything she touches. The business, the family, my own mind when she can manage it." The clarity in his voice was unmistakable. This was not a man suffering from dementia or cognitive decline. This was someone who understood exactly what was happening to him and was fighting against it with whatever strength he had left. "Uncle Frank, I need to ask you some difficult questions," I said. "About your medical care, about the business decisions that have been made in your name. But first, are you feeling clear-headed right now? Do you understand what we're discussing?" "Clear as I've been in weeks," he replied firmly. "Maria, did you give me the heart medication this morning?" "No, senor," Maria replied from her position by the door, where she was keeping watch for any unexpected arrivals. "Only the vitamins, like you asked." "The heart medication makes me foggy," Uncle Frank explained to me. "Veronica insists I take it twice daily, says the doctor ordered it for my condition. But when I skip doses, my mind clears up considerably." I pulled out my phone and activated the voice recording app, setting it on the side table where it would capture our conversation clearly. "Uncle Frank, I'm going to record what we discussed today. Is that okay with you?" "More than okay," he said, straightening in his chair with something approaching his old authority. "I've been hoping for a chance to set the record straight about a lot of things. Let's start with your medical condition," I said. "Have you been diagnosed with dementia or cognitive decline by your longtime physician?" "Dr. Patterson has been my doctor for 30 years, Uncle Frank replied. "Last time I saw him, about 2 weeks before my heart episode, he said I was sharp as a tack for a man my age. Recommended I keep working as long as I enjoyed it, said the mental stimulation was probably good for me." "But you've been seeing a different doctor since your heart attack." "Dr. Hendricks," Uncle Frank said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "A neurologist from Denver, who Veronica insisted I needed to see. Claims I'm suffering from rapid onset dementia brought on by cardiac stress. Do you believe that diagnosis is accurate?" Uncle Frank laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Zara, I can tell you the serial number of every piece of major equipment we own, the terms of every significant contract we've signed in the past 5 years, and the birthday of every employee who's been with us more than a decade. Does that sound like dementia to you?" I felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Everything Linda had suspected was true. Uncle Frank was being systematically drugged and medically misrepresented to justify Veronica's control over his affairs. "Have you signed any legal documents since your heart attack?" I asked. "Power of attorney agreements, changes to your will, anything involving the business?" "That's where things get interesting," Uncle Frank said, his eyes taking on the calculating look I remembered from business negotiations. "Veronica has presented me with several documents to sign, claiming they were just routine updates to my medical directives. But I've been pretending to be more confused than I actually am, stalling, and asking questions until she gets frustrated and leaves." "So you haven't signed anything?" "I've signed a few things, but not the documents she thinks I signed," Uncle Frank said with a slight smile. "The beauty of being considered mentally incompetent is that people stop paying close attention to details. I've been substituting blank pages for the actual documents, signing meaningless papers while the real agreements remain unsigned." The cleverness of his strategy was breathtaking. While pretending to be a confused old man, Uncle Frank had been conducting a counterintelligence operation against his own family, protecting his legal autonomy while gathering information about their plans. "What kinds of documents has she been trying to get you to sign?" I asked. "Power of attorney agreements that would give your father complete control over my assets," Uncle Frank replied. "A revised will that would leave everything to him instead of following the distribution plan I actually want. And most recently, authorization to sell significant portions of the quarry land to a development company in Denver. The implications of that last revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. Selling quarry land would fundamentally change the nature of our business, potentially destroying the operational capacity that had made Donovan Stone and Aggregate successful for 3 generations. "Do you know which development company?" I asked. "Pinnacle Mountain Properties," Uncle Frank said. "And here's the interesting part. The proposed sale price is about 30% below current market value for industrial land in this area." "That doesn't make business sense," I said, thinking through the financial implications. "Unless there's some kind of kickback arrangement or personal benefit that isn't reflected in the official sale terms." "Exactly what I was thinking," Uncle Frank agreed. "Which is why I asked Maria to do some research on Pinnacle Mountain Properties while Veronica was out of the house." Maria stepped forward, pulling a folder from beneath the stack of clean towels she'd been carrying. "The company is owned by a holding corporation that traces back to Marcus Donovan and Veronica Donovan as primary shareholders." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. Veronica wasn't just trying to control the family business. She was planning to dismantle it, selling off the most valuable assets to a company she and Marcus secretly owned, effectively stealing millions of dollars in family wealth while making it look like legitimate business transactions. "They're planning to liquidate everything," I said, the scope of the betrayal finally becoming clear. "Strip out the valuable land and assets, then abandon the operational business that supports all our employees." "That would be my assessment," Uncle Frank agreed grimly. "And once they have legal control over my estate, there would be very little anyone could do to stop them." I looked around the room, taking in the photographs and mementos that represented a lifetime of honest work and family loyalty. Uncle Frank had spent decades building something meaningful, creating jobs and supporting a community, only to see it threatened by people who viewed it as nothing more than a financial opportunity to be exploited. "Uncle Frank, I need to ask you about some documents that Linda Castellano mentioned," I said. "Papers you supposedly hid in your safe before your heart attack." His face lit up with something approaching his old mischievous grin. "Linda was always too smart for her own good. Yes, there are documents in my safe that Veronica doesn't know about. Documents that would change her plans considerably if she knew they existed." "What kind of documents?" "A revised partnership agreement that I had drawn up about a week before my heart episode," Uncle Frank explained. "It clarifies the succession structure of the business and establishes a trust fund that would protect the operational assets from being sold or liquidated." "Can you access the safe?" I asked, glancing at Maria to gauge how much time we had left. "We have about 2 hours before Veronica returns," Maria said, understanding my unspoken question. "But the safe is in the study downstairs, and she has been spending a lot of time in that room lately." Uncle Frank struggled to his feet, moving slowly but with determination. "The safe hasn't been opened since before my heart attack. Veronica doesn't know the combination, and she's been trying to figure out how to get into it without raising suspicions." We made our way downstairs carefully, Uncle Frank leaning on my arm but moving with more strength than I'd expected. The study was a masculine room lined with law books and business journals, dominated by a massive oak desk that had belonged to my grandfather. Behind the desk, built into the wall, was a safe that looked like it could withstand a direct assault. Uncle Frank worked the combination with practiced ease, his fingers moving confidently across the numbered dial despite the tremor that affected his hands during normal activities. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing stacks of documents, some cash, and several items that looked like personal mementos. "Here," he said, pulling out a thick folder bound with a red ribbon. "This contains the revised partnership agreement, my actual will dated from last year, and documentation of some financial irregularities I'd discovered in our accounts." I opened a folder carefully, scanning documents that were clearly different from anything Veronica had been trying to get Uncle Frank to sign. The revised partnership agreement was particularly interesting, establishing a trust structure that would protect the business from liquidation, while ensuring that control passed to family members who demonstrated commitment to the company's operational integrity rather than just its financial value. "Uncle Frank, this agreement names me as the primary successor to your partnership stake," I said, reading through the legal language carefully. "Are you sure that's what you intended?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything," he replied firmly. "You're the only member of this family who understands that the business is about more than just making money. You know the workers, you understand the equipment, and you care about the community that depends on us." I felt the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle I wasn't sure I was ready to wear. But I also felt a surge of determination to prove myself worthy of Uncle Frank's trust. "There's one more thing," Uncle Frank said, reaching deeper into the safe. "A recording I made the night before my heart attack, when I realized that Veronica's intentions were more serious than I'd initially understood." He pulled out a small digital recorder, similar to the one Linda had used at the diner, but older and more worn. "I've been keeping this as insurance, in case something happened to me before I could properly document her activities." "What's on the recording?" I asked. "A conversation between Veronica and Marcus that I overheard when they thought I was asleep," Uncle Frank replied. "It should clarify any remaining questions about their ultimate intentions for the family business." He pressed play, and Veronica's voice filled the study, as clear and damning as it had been on Linda's recording. "The old man is getting suspicious," Veronica was saying. "He's been asking too many questions about the financial projections and the consultant reports." Marcus's voice responded, younger but equally calculating. "Maybe it's time to accelerate the timeline. The longer we wait, the more chance there is that he'll figure out what we're really planning." "I've already spoken to Dr. Hendricks about adjusting his medication regimen," Veronica replied. "A higher dosage should ensure that he remains manageable until we can get the legal documents finalized." "What about Zara?" Marcus asked. "She's been asking questions about Uncle Frank's condition, and some of the workers still see her as a legitimate voice in company operations." "Zara is sentimental and naive," Veronica said dismissively. "She thinks the business should be run like some kind of charity operation, prioritizing worker welfare over profit maximization. Once we have control, we can restructure her role to something more appropriate for her skill level." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning she can have a nice title and a small office somewhere, but no real authority over operational decisions," Veronica explained. "The important thing is maintaining the appearance of family continuity while implementing modern business practices." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing plans that went far beyond simple corporate restructuring. Veronica and Marcus were planning to sell off the most profitable operations to their own holding company, eliminate long-time employees to reduce labor costs, and eventually relocate the remaining operations to areas with lower environmental regulations and cheaper labor pools. By the time the recording ended, I felt sick with anger and betrayal. This wasn't just about money or control. It was about the systematic destruction of everything my grandfather and Uncle Frank had built, the elimination of dozens of jobs that supported families throughout Millfield, and the conversion of a community asset into a purely extractive financial instrument. "When did you make this recording?" I asked, my voice shaking with emotion. "The night of September 15th, Uncle Frank replied. "I had my heart attack the following morning." The timing was devastating. Uncle Frank had discovered the plot against him, and had one night to make preparations before suffering a cardiac episode that conveniently incapacitated him, just as he was gathering evidence of his family's betrayal. "Uncle Frank, do you think the stress of learning about their plans contributed to your heart attack?" I asked carefully. "I think the stress of realizing that my own family was planning to destroy my life's work would give anyone a heart attack," he replied grimly. "But I also think there might be more to the timing than simple coincidence." Maria, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up quietly. "Signor Frank, you should tell her about the tea." Uncle Frank's expression darkened. "The night I made that recording, Veronica brought me a cup of chamomile tea to help me sleep. Said she was worried about my stress levels and wanted to make sure I got proper rest." "Did you drink it?" I asked, though I was beginning to fear the answer. "Most of it," Uncle Frank admitted. I started feeling strange about halfway through. Dizzy and nauseous, with chest pains that got progressively worse throughout the night. The implications were chilling. If Veronica had deliberately induced Uncle Frank's heart attack, then we were dealing with attempted murder, not just financial fraud. But proving such a claim would require medical evidence that was probably long gone. "We need to get you to a doctor," I said urgently. Someone who can test for traces of whatever might have been in that tea. Too late for that, Uncle Frank replied. But not too late to prevent them from finishing what they started. He reached into the safe one more time, pulling out a document that looked different from the others, more formal and official. This is a healthcare directive I had prepared by a lawyer who specializes in elder law. It revokes any medical power of attorney that Veronica might claim, and specifically authorizes you to make medical decisions on my behalf if I become incapacitated. Is this legally binding? I asked, examining the notarized document. As binding as any document can be, Uncle Frank confirmed. And it predates any claims of mental incompetence that Dr. Hendricks might have made. I carefully placed all the documents back in the folder, understanding that I was now holding evidence that could not only expose Veronica's conspiracy, but also restore Uncle Frank's legal autonomy and protect the business from liquidation. What do we do now? I asked, looking between Uncle Frank and Maria. Now we make some phone calls, Uncle Frank said, moving toward the desk phone with more energy than I'd seen from him all afternoon. Starting with Judge Morrison, who's been a friend of this family for 40 years and has the authority to issue emergency injunctions. And after that? I asked. After that, we prepare for war, Uncle Frank replied grimly. Because when Veronica realizes that her carefully constructed house of cards is about to collapse, she's going to fight back with everything she has. As if summoned by his words, we heard the distinctive sound of Veronica's BMW pulling into the driveway, the engine noise carrying clearly through the study windows. She was back early, probably having cut short her Denver appointment for reasons we couldn't begin to guess. She's home, Maria whispered urgently. What do we do? Uncle Frank moved faster than I would have thought possible, gathering the documents and shoving them back into the safe, spinning the combination lock closed just as we heard Veronica's heels clicking across the front porch. Zara, get upstairs to my room, he said quietly. Maria, help me back to my chair and give me one of the heart pills to make me look confused again. But Uncle Frank, we need to call Judge Morrison, I protested. We'll call him tonight, after Veronica thinks everything is normal, Uncle Frank replied. For now, we need to protect what we've discovered until we can act on it properly. I grabbed the folder containing Uncle Frank's healthcare directive and the recording device, stuffing them inside my jacket as footsteps approached the study door. Maria helped Uncle Frank into his wheelchair, and I ducked behind the heavy drapes that covered the window alcove, just as Veronica entered the room. There you are, Frank. Veronica's voice carried clearly to my hiding spot. Maria said you wanted to come downstairs for a while. How are you feeling? Confused, Uncle Frank replied, his voice taking on the shaky quality I'd heard when I first arrived. I thought I heard voices, but I can't remember who was supposed to visit today. No one was supposed to visit, Veronica said firmly. You must have been dreaming again. The doctor says that's common with your condition. Through a gap in the drapes, I could see Veronica moving around the study, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. She paused at the safe, running her fingers along the edge of the door as if checking to see whether it had been disturbed. Frank, have you been trying to open the safe again? She asked, her tone suggesting this was an ongoing issue. I don't remember, Uncle Frank replied convincingly. Sometimes I think there are important papers in there, but I can't recall the combination. That's because there's nothing important in there anymore, Veronica said smoothly. Just old documents and sentimental items. Everything current is being handled by the appropriate legal and financial professionals. The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that I had to bite my tongue to keep from crying out in anger. Veronica was gaslighting Uncle Frank, making him doubt his own memories while systematically stealing his life's work. Let's get you back upstairs, Veronica continued. You've had enough excitement for one day, and I think it's time for your evening medication. Maria wheeled Uncle Frank out of the study, leaving me alone behind the drapes, with my heart pounding and documents that could change everything hidden in my jacket. I waited until I heard them reach the second floor before carefully making my way to the kitchen door, slipping out of the house the same way I'd entered. The drive back to town felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare only to discover that the monsters were real and more dangerous than you'd imagined. But for the first time in months, I also felt something that had been missing from my life: hope. Uncle Frank was fighting back. The evidence existed to expose Veronica's conspiracy, and I finally understood not just what was at stake, but what I needed to do to protect it. The real battle was just beginning, but now I had weapons to fight with. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Millfield. I was in my apartment above the feed store, reviewing the documents Uncle Frank had given me and preparing to call Judge Morrison, when I heard the distinctive rumble of diesel engines that didn't belong to our usual fleet. Through my window, I watched 3 black SUVs wind their way up the mountain road toward Overlook Manor, their government plates visible even from a distance. Behind them followed a van marked Colorado State Attorney General Elder Abuse Investigation Unit. My phone rang before I could fully process what I was seeing. "Zara, it's Linda. Are you watching the road?" "I see them," I replied, my heart racing. "Did you call the state?" "Judge Morrison did," Linda explained quickly. "After I played him the recordings last night and showed him the documents you photographed, he made some calls. Apparently, this kind of systematic elder abuse falls under federal jurisdiction when it involves interstate financial fraud." I watched the convoy disappear around the bend toward the manor, imagining Veronica's reaction when federal agents appeared at her door with search warrants and subpoenas. After months of carefully orchestrated deception, her carefully constructed world was about to collapse in spectacular fashion. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we let the professionals handle the investigation," Linda replied. "But Judge Morrison wants to see you at his office this afternoon. He has some questions about the partnership documents and the business structure." I spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, unable to concentrate on anything productive. Every few minutes, I found myself looking toward the manor, watching for signs of what was happening up there. Around noon, I saw Veronica's BMW speed down the mountain road faster than was safe, followed 20 minutes later by a police cruiser heading in the same direction. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emergency family meeting at the office at 2 p.m. Your presence is required." Thomas Donovan Dad was summoning me to a family meeting, probably to discuss damage control strategies and coordinate responses to whatever the investigators had discovered. The timing felt ominous, coming just hours after federal agents had raided the manor. I drove to the quarry office with Uncle Frank's healthcare directive hidden in my jacket and Linda's contact information programmed into my phone. Whatever Veronica and Dad had planned for this meeting, I was no longer the naive family member they could manipulate or dismiss. The parking lot was fuller than usual for a Friday afternoon. In addition to Dad's truck and the usual company vehicles, I recognized Marcus's rental car and 2 sedans that looked like they belonged to lawyers or accountants. Through the office windows, I could see people moving around with the urgent purposefulness that suggested crisis management was underway. I entered through the main door to find the office transformed into something resembling a war room. Charts and documents covered every available surface, and several people I didn't recognize were speaking in hushed tones while typing rapidly on laptops. The atmosphere felt like a political campaign on election night, when initial returns suggested the race wasn't going as expected. Helen Price looked up from her desk with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "Zara, thank goodness you're here. Your father's been asking for you every 10 minutes. "Who are all these people?" I asked, gesturing toward the strangers who'd taken over the normally quiet office space. "Legal consultants," Helen replied carefully. "Brought in to help navigate some complications that arose this morning." Before I could ask for clarification, Marcus emerged from the back office looking like he'd aged 5 years since I'd last seen him. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his hair uncombed. When he saw me, his expression cycled through several emotions too quickly for me to identify them all. "Zara," he said, approaching with the cautious demeanor of someone walking through a minefield. "We need to talk before you go in there." "About what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "About what you might have heard or been told by certain people who don't understand the full complexity of our family situation," Marcus replied, glancing nervously toward the legal consultants. "There have been some misunderstandings, some mischaracterizations of business decisions that were made with everyone's best interests in mind. The careful language felt like a scripted response, probably crafted by the legal team to minimize liability while preparing for damage control. Marcus was trying to get ahead of whatever Uncle Frank and I had discovered, to frame the narrative before I could present contradictory evidence. "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked innocently. "Uncle Frank's condition is more serious than we initially realized," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of practiced concern. "The doctors say that cognitive decline can manifest in many ways, including paranoid delusions and false memories. Sometimes patients become convinced that their caregivers are plotting against them." "That's convenient," I replied, making no effort to hide my skepticism. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Zara, I know you care about Uncle Frank, but you need to understand that his perception of reality isn't reliable anymore. Acting on his delusions could cause serious harm to everyone involved, including him." "What if his perceptions are accurate?" I asked. "What if the medical diagnoses are wrong?" "Then we'll deal with that possibility through proper medical channels," Marcus replied smoothly. "But in the meantime, we need to present a united family front. The investigators who were here this morning are looking for divisions they can exploit, contradictions they can use to justify their interference in our private family matters." The way he framed federal investigation as interference rather than protection told me everything I needed to know about Marcus's perspective on the situation. He saw law enforcement as an enemy to be managed rather than a resource for uncovering truth. "Marcus, before I talk to Dad, I need to know something," I said. "Are you and Veronica planning to sell company assets to Pinnacle Mountain Properties?" His face went pale, confirming what I'd already suspected. "Where did you hear that name?" "Does it matter where I heard it?" I asked. "Is it true?" "It's complicated," Marcus said, which was not a denial. "There are financial pressures you don't understand, market conditions that require strategic responses. Sometimes protecting the core business means divesting peripheral assets." "The quarry land isn't peripheral," I pointed out. "It's the foundation of everything we do." "Zara, you're thinking like an operator, not an owner," Marcus replied, his tone becoming patronizing. "Owners have to make decisions based on long-term financial projections, not sentimental attachments to particular pieces of equipment or real estate." "And what about the workers who depend on those particular pieces of equipment?" I asked. "What about the families whose livelihoods depend on operational continuity?" Quote, "Workers are adaptable," Marcus said dismissively. "Markets change. Industries evolve. Our responsibility is to maximize shareholder value, not to preserve employment for its own sake." The coldness in his voice was shocking. This was my stepbrother, someone I'd grown up with, someone who'd played in these same quarries as a child. Now he was talking about dismantling our family's legacy as if it were a purely abstract financial exercise. "Shareholders," I repeated. "Who exactly are the shareholders in Pinnacle Mountain Properties?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant to this conversation." "It's relevant if family members are personally profiting from the sale of company assets at below-market prices," I replied. "That would be self-dealing, wouldn't it?" Before Marcus could respond, Dad appeared in the doorway of the back office, looking haggard and defeated. The confident businessman who'd once commanded respect throughout the industry had been replaced by someone who looked overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. "Zara, thank you for coming," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely happy to see me. "We have a lot to discuss." I followed him into the back office, which had been converted into a conference room with additional chairs and a speakerphone set up. Veronica sat at the far end of the table, flanked by two men in expensive suits who were obviously attorneys. Her normally perfect composure showed cracks around the edges, stress lines that no amount of makeup could completely conceal. "Zara, please sit down," Dad said, gesturing toward a chair that positioned me across from Veronica and her legal team. "We need to address some serious allegations that have been made against our family." "What kind of allegations?" I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew. One of the attorneys leaned forward, consulting a legal pad covered with notes. "Elder abuse, financial exploitation, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The state investigators seem to believe that Mrs. Donovan has been systematically manipulating Franklin Donovan's medical care and legal decision-making capacity. Quote, "Have they presented any evidence to support these allegations?" I asked, They claim to have recordings and documents, the attorney replied carefully. But the admissibility and authenticity of such evidence would be subject to significant legal challenges. Veronica spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room, her voice tightly controlled. Zara, I need you to understand something. Your uncle is very sick. His mind isn't working properly anymore, and sometimes sick people become convinced that the people trying to help them are actually trying to hurt them. What if he's not as sick as you think he is? I asked. Multiple medical professionals have evaluated his condition, Veronica replied. Dr. Hendricks is one of the most respected neurologists in the region. Her diagnosis is based on extensive testing and clinical observation. Testing that Uncle Frank consented to? I asked. Consent given by someone suffering from cognitive decline isn't always meaningful, Veronica said smoothly. That's why families sometimes have to make difficult decisions on behalf of their loved ones. The second attorney cleared his throat. Miss Donovan, we understand that you may have had contact with your uncle recently. If he said things that seemed concerning or confusing, it's important that you understand the context of his medical condition. What if what he said wasn't confusing at all? I asked. What if it was perfectly coherent and consistent with someone who understands exactly what's happening to him? Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Zara, I know this is difficult to accept, but Uncle Frank isn't the man he used to be. The doctors say that patients with his condition can have periods of apparent clarity that are actually symptoms of the disease itself. That's convenient, I said, echoing my earlier response to Marcus. Any evidence that contradicts your narrative can be dismissed as a symptom of illness. It's not convenient, it's tragic, Veronica said, her voice taking on a tone of wounded dignity. Do you think I enjoy watching a man I respect deteriorate this way? Do you think any of us wanted this situation? I think someone wanted control of Uncle Frank's assets, I replied bluntly. And I think that person was willing to use whatever means necessary to get it. The room fell silent except for the scratching of pens on legal pads as the attorneys took notes. Dad looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, while Veronica's mask of concerned family member finally slipped to reveal something much colder underneath. Zara, the first attorney said carefully, if you have information relevant to this investigation, you should know that providing false or misleading statements to federal investigators is a serious federal crime. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They were warning me against contradicting their version of events, against presenting evidence that would support the abuse allegations. I understand, I replied. I also understand that concealing evidence of criminal activity is obstruction of justice. I reached into my jacket and pulled out Uncle Frank's healthcare directive, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. This document, properly notarized and legally binding, revokes any medical power of attorney that Veronica might claim over Uncle Frank's care. Veronica lunged forward to grab the document, but I was faster, sliding it back toward my side of the table. This is dated 6 months ago, before any claims of cognitive decline were made. It specifically authorizes me to make medical decisions if Uncle Frank becomes incapacitated. That document is meaningless if it was signed by someone who is already mentally incompetent, the second attorney said quickly. Then you'll need to prove that Uncle Frank was incompetent 6 months ago, I replied. Before he was seeing Dr. Hendricks, while he was still under the care of his longtime physician, who found no evidence of cognitive decline. Dad finally found his voice. Zara, what are you trying to accomplish here? We're family. We should be working together to protect Uncle Frank and preserve what our grandfather built. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, I said. Protect Uncle Frank from people who are exploiting his medical condition for financial gain. You don't understand the complexities of the situation, Veronica said, her composure beginning to crack. The business is facing challenges you can't even comprehend. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made to ensure survival. Like selling valuable assets to companies owned by family members? I asked. The question landed like a bomb in the middle of the conference table. Both attorneys immediately began writing furiously, while Dad's face went white and Veronica's eyes flashed with something that looked like panic. How did you? Marcus began, then stopped himself. How did I find out about Pinnacle Mountain Properties? I finished. The same way I found out about the forged power of attorney documents and the systematic drugging designed to keep Uncle Frank compliant. Those are serious accusations, the first attorney said. Do you have evidence to support them? I have recordings, I replied. Multiple recordings of conversations between Veronica and Marcus discussing their plans to liquidate company assets and eliminate employees they consider expendable. Recordings obtained without consent are inadmissible in court, the second attorney pointed out. Maybe, I agreed, but they're certainly admissible in the court of public opinion. And they provide probable cause for search warrants that could uncover additional evidence. Veronica stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and listen to paranoid fantasies from someone who's clearly been manipulated by a sick old man. Sit down, Veronica, Dad said quietly, but with more authority than he'd shown in months. We need to hear what Zara has to say. Thomas, you can't seriously be considering, Veronica began. I said sit down, Dad repeated, his voice growing stronger. For 3 years I've been deferring to your judgment about business decisions and family matters. Maybe it's time I started asking some questions of my own. Veronica remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. After everything I've done for this family, everything I've sacrificed to help you modernize and succeed, this is how you repay me? What exactly have you sacrificed? I asked. Your plan to liquidate the business through shell companies you secretly own doesn't sound like sacrifice to me. You have no idea what you're talking about, Veronica snapped. The construction industry is changing. Environmental regulations are making quarry operations increasingly expensive. Labor costs are rising faster than revenues. Without significant restructuring, this business will be bankrupt within 5 years. So your solution is to strip out the valuable assets and abandon the operational business? I asked. My solution is to maximize recovery for the family before market conditions make that impossible, Veronica replied. But you're too sentimental to understand basic financial reality. And Uncle Frank was too inconvenient to be allowed to participate in those decisions? I pressed. Uncle Frank is living in the past, Veronica said dismissively. He thinks business can still be conducted with handshake deals and lifetime employment guarantees. That model doesn't work in the modern economy. It works for our competitors, I pointed out. Morrison Aggregate has been family-owned for 4 generations. So has Canyon Creek Stone. They seem to be managing just fine without liquidating their assets. They're not dealing with the same regulatory pressures we are, Marcus interjected, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the conference room. What regulatory pressures? I asked. Our environmental compliance record is excellent. Our safety ratings are above industry standards. What exactly are these pressures you keep talking about? Marcus exchanged a glance with Veronica that lasted a fraction of a second too long. In that brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were no regulatory pressures. No impending financial crisis. No market conditions that required desperate measures. There aren't any, are there? I said quietly. The business is profitable. The regulatory environment is stable. You manufactured a crisis to justify liquidation because you wanted the money now, rather than waiting for a natural succession process. That's absurd, Veronica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? I asked. Because if the business really was in financial trouble, liquidation at below market prices wouldn't make sense. You'd want to maximize sale values to preserve as much family wealth as possible. The first attorney cleared his throat. Miss Donovan, these are complex financial matters that require professional analysis. No, I interrupted. These are simple math problems. If you own something worth $10 million, you don't sell it for $7 million unless you're getting some kind of personal benefit that isn't reflected in the official transaction. I stood up, pulling out my phone and activating the voice recording app. Dad, I need you to answer a direct question, and I need your answer on the record. Are you a shareholder in Pinnacle Mountain Properties? Dad's face went gray. He looked at Veronica, then at Marcus, then back at me. Zara, you don't understand. Yes or no, Dad? Are you a shareholder in the company that's supposed to buy our quarry land? It's not that simple, Dad said weakly. It's exactly that simple, I replied. Either you have a financial interest in the buyer or you don't. Either this is an arm's-length transaction or it's self-dealing. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Dad nodded slowly. Veronica set up the holding company structure. She said it was the only way to ensure that the family retained some benefit from the land sale. And you didn't think that might be illegal? I asked. We consulted with attorneys, Dad said defensively. Everything was structured to be technically compliant with applicable regulations. Technically compliant, I repeated, but ethically bankrupt. I turned off the recording and put my phone away. Dad, I need you to understand something. Uncle Frank isn't sick. He's being drugged to make him appear incompetent so that Veronica can control his assets. The medical diagnoses are fraudulent. The power of attorney documents are forged. And the land sale is a scheme to steal millions of dollars from the family estate. You can't prove any of that, Veronica said, but her voice was shaking now. Actually, I can, I replied, because Uncle Frank has been pretending to be more confused than he actually is. He's been documenting everything, recording conversations, and preserving evidence. While you thought you were manipulating a helpless old man, he was building a federal case against you. The color drained from Veronica's face. That's impossible. He can barely remember his own name most days. Only when you're around, I said. Only when he's been given the medications that Dr. Hendricks prescribed to keep him compliant. When he's alert and unmedicated, he's sharp enough to run circles around all of you. I reached into my other jacket pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder Uncle Frank had given me. This contains 18 months of conversations between you and Marcus, detailed discussions of your plans to liquidate the business and eliminate longtime employees. It also contains evidence that you deliberately induced Uncle Frank's heart attack. That's a lie, Veronica said, but she was backing toward the door now. Is it? I asked, because if traces of cardiac stimulants are found in Uncle Frank's system during his medical evaluation today, you're going to be facing attempted murder charges, in addition to everything else. Dad stared at me in horror. Zara, what are you saying? I'm saying that Uncle Frank didn't have a heart attack because of stress, I replied. He had a heart attack because Veronica put something in his tea the night he discovered your conspiracy. Veronica's mask finally fell away completely, revealing a fury so intense it was almost frightening. You self-righteous little bitch. You have no idea what you've done. You've destroyed everything we worked for, everything we built. I've protected what my grandfather actually built, I corrected, from people who wanted to destroy it for personal profit. One of the attorneys stood up quickly. Mrs. Donovan, I strongly advise you not to say anything else without counsel present. But Veronica was beyond taking advice. 40 years of family business, down the drain because a spoiled child couldn't accept that the world had changed. You think you're protecting something precious, but you're just ensuring that it dies slowly instead of quickly. I'm ensuring that it survives, I said firmly. Under management that cares about more than quarterly profit margins. You? Veronica laughed bitterly. You're gonna run a multi-million-dollar operation? You can't even handle watching a toddler without nearly getting him killed. The reference to Ethan's near accident felt like a slap, but I didn't flinch. That toddler was nearly killed because his mother abandoned him in a dangerous workplace to pursue her schemes. I saved his life, just like I'm saving this business. Dad finally found his voice again. What happens now, Zara? What are you planning to do with all this evidence? I'm planning to turn it over to the federal investigators, I replied, along with Uncle Frank's testimony and the documents he preserved. The legal system will decide what crimes were committed and what the appropriate penalties should be. And the business? Dad asked quietly. The business will continue operating, I said, under the succession plan that Uncle Frank established in his revised partnership agreement, with management that understands the difference between modernization and liquidation. Marcus stood up abruptly. This is insane. You can't seriously think you're qualified to run this operation. I think I'm more qualified than people who see it as nothing more than a pile of assets to be sold, I replied. And I think Uncle Frank agrees with me. Uncle Frank is a sick old man whose judgment is compromised. Marcus said desperately. Uncle Frank is a sharp businessman whose judgment is about to be validated by federal investigators, I corrected. When they finish their evaluation, everyone will know that his mental capacity was never compromised by anything, except the medications Veronica was giving him. The second attorney gathered his papers quickly. Mrs. Donovan, Mr. Donovan, I think we need to schedule an immediate consultation to discuss our legal options. Our legal options, Veronica said bitterly, are probably limited to plea bargaining and damage control. She turned to face me directly, her eyes burning with hatred. I hope you're proud of yourself, Zara. You've destroyed your own family to satisfy your ego. I've saved my family from people who were destroying it, I replied calmly, and I've protected the people who depend on us for their livelihoods. Those people will all be unemployed within a year, Veronica predicted, because you don't have the business knowledge or financial resources to sustain operations under current market conditions. Then I'll learn, I said simply. And I'll find the resources. Because that's what people do when they care about something more than their own immediate gratification. Dad looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in the legal documents and crisis management equipment that had transformed his familiar office into something alien and hostile. How did it come to this? He asked quietly, though I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. It came to this because you let it, I said, not unkindly, but without sugarcoating the truth. You abdicated your responsibility as head of this family and let someone else make decisions that should have been yours to make. I thought I was protecting everyone, Dad said weakly. You are protecting yourself, I replied. From conflict, from difficult decisions, from the hard work of actually leading. But leadership isn't about avoiding problems. It's about solving them. The room fell silent again, as the weight of 3 years of poor decisions settled over everyone like a blanket of regret and recrimination. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of quarry operations continuing, workers and equipment maintaining the rhythm of productivity that had sustained our family and community for 3 generations. Those sounds represented something worth fighting for, something worth the pain and conflict that would inevitably follow from this confrontation. Whatever happened next, I was committed to ensuring that the legacy my grandfather had built would survive the crisis that had nearly destroyed it. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in months, I felt equal to the challenge. 6 months later, I stood in the same quarry office where everything had fallen apart, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Gone were the crisis management consultants and emergency legal meetings. Instead, the space buzzed with the productive energy of a business finding its footing again after weathering a devastating storm. Helen Price looked up from her computer with a smile that had been absent for far too long. The Morrison aggregate contract came through this morning. They want us to supply stone for their expansion project in Colorado Springs. That's fantastic news, I replied, reviewing the quarterly reports spread across my desk. The numbers told a story of steady recovery, of relationships rebuilt, and trust slowly restored. It hadn't been easy, but we were proving that ethical business practices and financial success weren't mutually exclusive. Uncle Frank appeared in the doorway, moving with the steady confidence of a man whose health had dramatically improved once the unnecessary medications were eliminated from his routine. Federal investigators had confirmed that Dr. Hendrick's treatment regimen included several drugs that could cause cognitive impairment when used in combination, effectively creating the symptoms of dementia that had justified Veronica's control over his affairs. How are the new safety protocols working out? Uncle Frank asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. At 78, he'd officially stepped back from daily operations, but his advisory role kept him connected to the business he'd helped build while ensuring I had the benefit of his decades of experience. Carlos says the crews love them, I reported. Productivity is actually up 15% since we implemented the enhanced training programs. The safety improvements had been one of my first priorities after taking over operations. While Veronica had focused on cutting costs by reducing training and safety oversight, I'd invested in comprehensive programs that protected workers while improving efficiency. It turned out that people worked better when they felt valued and secure. Any word from the legal team about the final settlements? Uncle Frank asked. Everything should be wrapped up by the end of the month, I replied. Veronica agreed to the plea agreement, and Marcus is cooperating fully with the restitution process. The legal aftermath had been complex but ultimately satisfying. Veronica faced federal charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy, while Marcus had been charged with aiding and abetting financial crimes. Dad had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with investigators and agreeing to comprehensive restitution, but his relationship with the family business had been permanently severed. The most gratifying aspect of the legal resolution was the recovery of assets that had been diverted through the Pinnacle Mountain Properties scheme. When investigators traced the holding company structure, they discovered millions of dollars in family wealth that had been systematically transferred over the course of 3 years. All of it was being returned to Uncle Frank's estate and the legitimate business operations. "What about the expansion plans?" Uncle Frank asked, his eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm I remembered from childhood discussions about quarry operations and equipment purchases. "The environmental impact study came back clean," I said, pulling out the architect's drawings we'd commissioned for the new processing facility. "We can break ground on the secondary crushing operation next spring." The expansion represented everything Veronica's approach had failed to understand about sustainable business growth. Instead of liquidating existing assets, we were reinvesting profits into increased capacity and improved efficiency. The new facility would create 15 permanent jobs while positioning us to compete for larger contracts throughout the region. "Your grandfather would be proud," Uncle Frank said quietly, studying the blueprints with obvious satisfaction. He always said the secret to longevity in this business was thinking like a steward rather than an owner. "What's the difference?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Owners extract value," Uncle Frank explained. "Stewards cultivate it. Owners think about maximizing their return on investment. Stewards think about maximizing the return for everyone who depends on the investment." It was a philosophy that had guided every major decision I'd made since taking control of the company. When longtime employees had worried about job security during the leadership transition, I'd implemented profit-sharing programs that gave everyone a stake in our success. When customers had expressed concerns about continuity during the legal crisis, I'd personally visited every major account to reaffirm our commitment to quality and reliability. The approach was working. Not only had we retained all our major contracts, but word was spreading throughout the industry that Donovan Stone and Aggregate was a company that honored its commitments and treated people fairly. New business was coming to us specifically because potential customers wanted to work with an organization that shared their values. Maria appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with coffee and the homemade cookies that had become a Friday afternoon tradition. "How are my 2 favorite business executives doing?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her the emotional center of our family for so many years. "Better every week," I replied honestly. "Maria, thank you again for everything you did to help Uncle Frank during those difficult months. I don't know what would have happened without your courage." "Family protects family," Maria said simply, as if risking her job to expose elder abuse was the most natural thing in the world. "Besides, I could not stand watching that woman hurt Señor Frank while pretending to care for him." Uncle Frank reached over and squeezed Maria's hand gently. "You saved my life, Maria. If you hadn't helped Zara reach me when you did, Veronica might have succeeded in having me declared completely incompetent." "Speaking of family," Maria said, her expression becoming mischievous, "little Ethan is asking when Aunt Zara is coming to visit again. That boy adores you." The custody arrangement that had emerged from Dad's legal troubles allowed me to spend time with Ethan on weekends, giving him stability and continuity while Dad worked to rebuild his life after the financial and reputational devastation of the scandal. It was one of the unexpected blessings that had emerged from the crisis, the opportunity to maintain a relationship with my little brother despite everything that had happened. "Tell him I'll be by tomorrow morning," I said. "We're going to build a fort in the backyard and have a picnic." "He will be so excited," Maria said, beaming. "That child needs positive influences in his life, especially now." Dad was struggling with the aftermath of his choices, trying to rebuild both his personal integrity and his professional reputation, after losing almost everything. The divorce proceedings had been particularly difficult, with Veronica attempting to claim half of all family assets despite her criminal conviction. Ultimately, the prenuptial agreement Uncle Frank had insisted upon years earlier had protected most of the family wealth, but the emotional toll on everyone had been substantial. How was he adjusting to the new living situation? Uncle Frank asked, his concern for Dad evident despite everything that had happened. Some days are harder than others, I replied honestly, but I think he's starting to understand the difference between being a victim of someone else's manipulation and being responsible for his own choices. Dad's therapy sessions were helping him work through the complex emotions surrounding his relationship with Veronica and his abdication of leadership responsibilities. It was painful but necessary work, the kind of honest self-examination that could eventually lead to genuine redemption and reconciliation. "And what about you, Mija?" Maria asked, settling into a chair with her own cup of coffee. "Are you taking care of yourself while you take care of everyone else?" It was a fair question. The transition to running a multi-million-dollar operation had been overwhelming at times, requiring me to learn financial management, legal compliance, and strategic planning while maintaining the operational knowledge that had always been my strength. But it was also deeply satisfying work, the fulfillment of a purpose I'd never fully understood until I was called upon to embrace it. "I'm learning something new every day," I said, "and I'm surrounded by people who want to see the business succeed. That makes all the difference." The employee retention rate since the leadership change had been remarkable. Workers who had been preparing to leave during Veronica's cost-cutting phase had committed to staying when they realized that the new management philosophy prioritized their welfare alongside profitability. Productivity, safety metrics, and morale surveys all showed dramatic improvement over the past 6 months. "Carlos wants to know if you're serious about the apprenticeship program," Helen called out from her desk. "He has 3 young people in mind who would be perfect candidates." "Absolutely serious," I replied. "The skills shortage in our industry is only going to get worse unless we start training the next generation ourselves." The apprenticeship program was another initiative that differentiated our approach from the extractive mindset that had nearly destroyed the company. Instead of viewing workers as expendable costs to be minimized, we were investing in their development and creating pathways for advancement that would ensure our long-term success. "Your grandfather started as an apprentice," Uncle Frank noted, "worked his way up from loading trucks to owning the operation. That's how you build institutional knowledge and company loyalty. It's also how you build a workforce that understands quality standards because they've been trained properly from the beginning," I added. "Carlos says the industry average for safety incidents is 3 times higher than what we've achieved with our training programs." Uncle Frank nodded approvingly. "Safety first, quality second, profit third. If you get the first 2 right, the third takes care of itself." It was a philosophy that had guided our family business for 3 generations, temporarily abandoned during the Veronica years, but now restored as the foundation of our operational approach. The results spoke for themselves in customer satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, and financial performance that exceeded industry benchmarks. "There's something else we should discuss," I said, pulling out a folder that had been sitting on my desk for several days. "I've been offered a position on the Regional Industry Association board. They want someone to chair the Sustainability Committee." "That's a significant honor," Uncle Frank said, his pride evident. "They only offer board positions to company leaders they respect and trust." "It would mean representing our industry's interests in discussions with state and federal regulators," I explained, "helping to shape policies that affect all the quarry operations in Colorado." "Your grandfather served on that board for 15 years, Uncle Frank recalled. "He always said it was important for family businesses to have a voice in industry governance, to ensure that regulations were practical and fair, rather than just politically motivated." The invitation represented recognition that Donovan Stone and Aggregate had not only survived its recent crisis, but had emerged as a model for ethical business practices in the construction materials industry. Our success story was being studied by other family businesses as an example of how to navigate succession challenges while maintaining operational integrity. "I think I'm going to accept," I said. "The time commitment is significant, but the opportunity to influence industry standards aligns with our values." "Your grandfather would definitely approve," Uncle Frank said with a smile. He believed that successful businesses had an obligation to strengthen the entire industry, not just maximize their own profits. The afternoon was winding down, and through the office windows, I could see the day shift preparing to clock out while the maintenance crews began their equipment inspections. The rhythm of quarry operations had become the soundtrack of my life, as familiar and comforting as music I'd grown up hearing. "Before you both leave," I said, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've taught me and supported me through this transition. I couldn't have done any of this without your guidance and encouragement." "You had the strength and integrity all along," Uncle Frank replied. "We just helped you recognize it. And now you're building something that will last for generations," Maria added. "Creating jobs for families. Providing materials for construction projects that improve people's lives. That's meaningful work, Mija." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, I remained at my desk for a few minutes longer, reviewing the reports and projections that told the story of our recovery and growth. The numbers were satisfying, but they represented something more important than financial success. They represented the preservation of a legacy, the protection of livelihoods, and the triumph of values over expedience. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda Castellano, who had been reinstated as Uncle Frank's assistant, and had become invaluable in helping me navigate the administrative complexities of business leadership. "Judge Morrison called to congratulate you on the Industry Association appointment. Says he knew your grandfather would be proud." Judge Morrison had become an unofficial advisor during the legal proceedings, his friendship with Uncle Frank extending into guidance for the family business as we worked to rebuild trust and credibility in the community. His validation meant more than any financial metric or industry recognition. I locked up the office and walked out into the Colorado evening, the mountain air crisp with the promise of winter. The quarry equipment sat silent under the security lights, ready for another day of productive work that would continue the legacy my grandfather had started and Uncle Frank had preserved. The drive home took me past the sites where our stone and aggregate had been used in construction projects throughout the valley. A new school building, a bridge renovation, a hospital expansion that would serve the community for decades to come. Every project represented families and futures built on the foundation of materials we'd supplied, work we'd completed, standards we'd maintained. At the small apartment I'd rented in town after leaving the family property, I found a package waiting by the door. Inside was a framed photograph that Dad had found while cleaning out his home office. A picture from my childhood showing me and Uncle Frank standing beside a newly delivered crusher, both of us wearing hard hats and grinning at the camera. The note attached was in Dad's handwriting. "Found this while packing up some old files. Thought you should have it. You were born for this work, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. Thank you for saving what we almost lost. Love, Dad." I hung the photograph on the wall next to my desk, where it would remind me every day of the responsibility I'd inherited and the trust that had been placed in me. The little girl in the picture had grown up believing that the family business was her birthright, had learned that it was actually something she'd have to fight for, and had discovered that the fight itself was what made the victory meaningful. Outside my window, the lights of Millfield sparkled in the valley below, a community sustained by industries like ours, families supported by businesses like ours, futures made possible by the choices we made every day about how to balance profit with purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new decisions that would shape the legacy I was now responsible for stewarding. But tonight, I was content to sit with the satisfaction of work well done, relationships rebuilt, and trust earned through the most difficult period of our family's history. The construction materials business would continue, stronger and more ethical than before, providing the foundation for projects and communities across Colorado. The workers who depended on us would continue to have secure employment, with fair wages and safe working conditions. The customers who trusted us would continue to receive quality materials delivered with integrity and reliability. And somewhere in the mountains surrounding Millfield, the stone that had built our family's fortune would continue to provide the raw materials for buildings and roads and bridges that would outlast all of us. Monuments to the enduring value of honest work and principled leadership. The legacy was secure, not because it had been inherited, but because it had been earned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.